you want to over hundreds of miles. And keeping it together for a period of time is a heroic, enormous feat. And if you can do that successfully, that practically spells victory. And the Revolutionary War is on the tail end of this era when it seems like half of the war is just simply keeping the army together rather than fighting the battle. So just in this series, if it seems like we're going over that so much, it's symptomatic of this era. So that's all I'll say about that. But let's get back to the battle proper. So what happens next after this first failed attempt?
All right, well, the Americans are not going to give up. And on March 10th, 1778, and just to put things in context, this is right before the Battle of Monmouth, which, if you remember from a previous episode, the British under General Howe, back in 1777, they had left New York and they'd marched toward Philadelphia to try to take the city. Washington had tried to stop them, and the result of that had been two battles, the Battle of Brandywine and the Battle of Germantown, both of which were British victories, but not overwhelming victories. The Americans handled themselves really well. Then the British had occupied Philadelphia while the Americans sat out the winter. That was the winter of Valley Forge. And then in the next spring, eventually it was more like the summer, the British returned to New York from Philadelphia. Washington hit them again at Monmouth. So that was what we talked about previously in 1777 and 1778. So this is, again, we're in Rhode Island, way to the north, but this appointment of John Sullivan to be commander-in-chief in Rhode Island, that is right before Monmouth. So this is after they're getting out of Valley Forge and the ice is melting, the snow is melting. John Sullivan, you've heard that name, listener, several times. He's been one of Washington's most reliable subordinates, faithful subordinate. Now he's going to get an independent command. So he goes up to Rhode Island. He begins recruiting more troops and planning another attack on Newport. On May 24th, so a couple months later, 500 British troops under the command of Lieutenant Colonel John Campbell landed near Bristol, Rhode Island, which is on the mainland. There they captured a small force of Rhode Island militia and destroyed their cannons. Then they marched to Warren, meeting no resistance. They burned more American property and supplies, especially boats. British and Hessian soldiers alike plundered and destroyed a lot of Patriot property. They then returned to Bristol, taking Patriot fire along the way, plundering and taking prisoners of most of the men that they encountered. A few days later, the force marched to Fall River, which is in Massachusetts, where they burned a sawmill, a grist mill, and many other supplies. So we're seeing a lot of burning and pillaging and destroying. The raids were very costly to the Continentals, and they served to delay any possible attack. But after these raids, Piggott decided to focus on strengthening Newport's defenses rather than conducting any further raids.
Yeah, so it seems like at this time that there is a war of attrition, and that had been happening from almost the beginning, but it becomes clearer now. So both sides realize the central war aim is sort of not to lose their armies. The Continental forces could perhaps see that the longer the military stays viable, the more likely the British were to quit. But then on the British side, they could see that if they were going to have another loss, like Burgoyne's loss at Saratoga, it could very well end the war. So, yeah, that's another factor here.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
So what happens when the campaign begins in earnest?
I do want to set the stage for our listeners and do somewhat of a mental map, which is my custom. Yes, the good old mental map. Rhode Island is an interesting shaped state. Definitely, again, as I always say, listeners, if possible, Google and pull up a map, especially if you can get one of Revolutionary era Rhode Island. So you have a significant mainland, and kind of there's a big, it's like a bite was taken out of a dinosaur took a giant bite out of the mainland and then spit out some things, and you got these islands. You've got Rhode Island or Aquidneck Island. It's the main island in the harbor, or the I don't know, the bay, whatever you want to call it. So it's kind of a north-south oriented island. Think again of a kind of like a big finger pointing down, or even it's almost shaped like a teardrop. And to the right of that is the mainland across a river, and it's then when you get further to the east, you get into Massachusetts. But there's a little bit more Rhode Island to the right on your mental map, or to the east of the island, the main island, Rhode Island. And then you go to the left, and that's the west, of course. There's more water, and then there's another island, a smaller island called Connaught Island. We'll be talking about that one too in a little bit. So again, the British have command of Aquidneck or Rhode Island, but the Patriots have the command of the surrounding mainland. All right, I hope that helps. Is that clear as mud?
Yeah. If you just look at the map, we have show notes, and you can follow along there.
Yeah, I was telling Scott, listeners, that I didn't even really know. I've learned so much about the geography of the North. I'm a Texas boy, I wasn't born in Texas, but I got here as fast as I could, as they say.
Yeah, you made up for that mistake of not being born in Texas as much as possible.
I didn't really know much about the specifics of the geography of places like Boston and New York City and Rhode Island, but now I've learned a lot. I've even been to these places, but I just didn't really pay attention. I just followed the road signs. I didn't really pay attention. Oh, look, here's an island, or here's water. So it's very interesting. All right. On February 6, 1778, the U.S. signed a formal treaty of alliance with France. We talked about that way back when we talked about Saratoga, or it feels way back anyway. American leaders were hoping that the French would soon send military and naval aid. That was the whole point of an alliance. Come help us. King Louis appointed Charles-Henri Theodat Comte d'Estaing, and I'll just call him d'Estaing from here. These French names of these nobles are super long. They're like 5, 6, 7 names. So d'Estaing was unpopular with his subordinates, mainly because his background was in the army, not the navy, and he had no experience commanding a fleet. But here he is. He's commanding a fleet now. It's like going to have some on-the-job training. D'Estaing's orders were to sail across the Atlantic, attack the British in North America wherever he thought would be best. Later, he was to sail to the Caribbean to threaten British possessions there and protect French ones. And I think we talked about this a while back, Scott, but once the French get involved in this war, it turns into a world war of sorts. There's going to be fighting in Europe. There's going to be fighting around India and other parts of the world, and particularly in the Caribbean. Really, economically, for Great Britain, the colonies in North America were small potatoes, at least compared to the Caribbean. The sugar islands in the Caribbean were where it was at. They were the real cash cows. Sugar was it was like the gold of the day. It was the huge product that really brought in money, both for the French and the British. So the French and British were going to fight more intensely over their colonies in the Caribbean. And we won't talk much about that because we're mainly focusing on North America. But we need to keep that in mind, that the French always have to keep an eye, and the British too, on the Caribbean, not just fight in the North American mainland.
Right. This is kind of reopening old wounds from the 7 Years' War. And just in our final episodes, when we talk about looking at the results of this from a global view, this is a monumental moment for the point of the Americans, but for the British, it's not as decisive in their history as American history, due to the reasons that you explained.
Yep. On April 13th, d'Estaing, along with 11 ships of the line, and a ship of the line is essentially the battleship of the day. These were massive wooden ships with many, many guns. They had to have a certain number of guns to be considered a ship of the line. Not sure what the exact number is, but I can tell you that in this case, he had a 50-gun ship, d'Estaing did, 4 frigates, which are smaller ships, plus 9,600 crew members, including Marines, hey, Semper Fi, and 1,000 soldiers. So this is an impressive invasion force, and they sail for North America. And after an agonizingly slow voyage of 87 days, they did not hustle. The French squadron reached the mouth of the Delaware River on July 8th. Had they arrived sooner, the French could have possibly trapped the British fleet that had been there just a few days earlier, but the British got away. So not a great first effort for the French fleet. Too slow. Anyway, they then proceeded to Sandy Hook, which is near New York City. From there, D'Estaing sent a message to Washington proposing a joint effort against Newport, which was a much better base of operations for the French fleet. The New York City area, it just had too many British in it. Newport would have been a great place, as we've already seen. It's a terrific harbor, great place to set up a French base. But the only problem is it's being occupied by the British right now. Washington sent, here we go again, Alexander Hamilton.
He's getting into the thick of this now, yeah.
He really is. Well, he's Washington's right-hand man, like another song in the Hamilton musical. He's trusted, and plus he speaks French, which is really handy. Washington wouldn't have gone himself anyway, but he did not know any French, or at least not much. So Hamilton goes to D'Estaing. He sends him a message that Washington agreed to this plan. He sent orders to John Sullivan, meanwhile, up in Newport to raise 5,000 New England troops. Meanwhile, the British sent reinforcements to reinforce their forces on Newport. On the 22nd of July, D'Estaing finally orders his fleet to sail for Newport. They moved slowly. They didn't arrive until the 29th. So it takes them 7 days to get from Sandy Hook, which is near New York City, to Newport, Rhode Island. Not exactly an express voyage here. And at the same time, Washington ordered 3 Continental brigades in New England to march to Providence. And he named the Marquis de Lafayette, his trusted associate, another one, and Nathaniel Greene to command the Continental forces that would attack Newport. So he's sending his A-team up there. Plus, he's already got John Sullivan. So he really, really wants Newport. You notice he's not sending Charles Lee. Charles Lee's kind of, his career is in mothballs right now. When the French fleet reached Newport, D'Estaing hesitated since the channels were unfamiliar to him. Also, the Americans had only assembled 1,600 troops, which even added to the 4,000 French soldiers present with the fleet were not enough to defeat the 5,700 well-entrenched British troops. You don't want to do one-on-one odds, especially when the enemy is dug in. So it's going to wait even more. Between July 30th and August 5th, the French fleet destroyed 5 British frigates, 2 sloops, and 3 rogue galleys. And this is a quote from a book that I read called The Rhode Island Campaign by Christian McBurney. He says, it's the most substantial single campaign loss of warships suffered by the British Navy in United States waters during the entire war. So the French are having fun picking off British ships. If they can't invade the land, let's go after the British Navy. Why not? The British also had to destroy 13 of their own transport vessels to hinder the sailing of French vessels. So they're using their ships to block the harbors and the waterways. The British pulled all their forces on Aqueduct Island into the Newport defenses, awaiting the Allied attack. So there we go. The British are hunkered down. The French are not quite ready to jump in, nor are the Americans, but there is a showdown coming.
Yeah, I wanted to mention one aside about the French involvement in the war at this point, because as we're talking about the French, I just want to have some other things in your mind where it sounds like they're not quite as involved on mainland affairs as Washington would prefer them at this point, because he's thinking, we have an alliance, send us troops, send us ships. And as James mentioned earlier, the heart of the British economy was in the Caribbean, not the North American mainland. That was also where a lot of French interests were, and that's where more of their military efforts went, which could sound frustrating to the Americans, but it had positive benefits that continue to multiply as the war goes on. So France's entry in the war has this benefit where Sir Henry Clinton was ordered to send 5,000 of his troops to the West Indies, where England perceived a weakness in its defenses. And with the French involvement, the Royal Navy had to shift major units to the Caribbean to confront the French there. So with these redeployments, it affects British ability to conduct offensive operations in America. They can't just easily send in more troops like they could in the early part of the war, because they thought, if we lose control of the Caribbean, this would be an economic disaster for England, and battling the Patriots almost becomes a secondary mission. So for the remainder of the war, Clinton receives no major reinforcements, and he has to be much more careful in his military planning because he can't risk losing troops. He just has to confine himself to raids and subversion. And the British could perhaps lose America with a strategy, but they did keep the British West Indies safe. So depending on how you look at things, maybe the British made the right choice. Like, what if they had gone all in